4분 남았어.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. We are going to take a look at today chapter 4 and chapter 5. I would say the most important chapter for you to understand because that part is dealing with macroeconomic development and kind of economic theory is involved to analyze kind of macroeconomic performance. So probably we will have to devote a lot of time today into some technical part, okay? I know that most of you are not necessarily economics major, so it could be a little bit boring, but you have to make sure that you understand what we will be discussing today, okay? Because that's a core part that you need to understand. 화면 공유할까? 어떤 거니? 오른쪽 거니 왼쪽 거니? 이게 lecture 5가 lecture 5.
4 하실죠?
lecture 4지.
네, 그거.
Okay. This part is we.
슬라이드 쇼에서 이거 크게 보여달라는
슬라이드 쇼가 요거지.
하고 한 번 더 들려주세요. 처음부터.
오케이. 그런데 우리가 여기서부터 안 하잖아. 그럼 내려가야지. 페이지 다운. 오케이. Okay, this is the part that we need to begin. This is what we call in pure economics terms, we call this type of analysis as growth accounting. In other words, how one economy has developed or has grown. So in other words, it's kind of a decomposition of the growth factors to some extent. So to explain the concept, QT is here, you have to understand that QT is just the output and frequently denoted as GDP, gross domestic product. So total goods and services produced in a given year. For example, Soviet economy, QT is Soviet economy's GDP, let's say. And we feel that GDP is coming from contribution of basically three sources. Two sources are denoted as LT, labor input. So you work in a company or in a factory or on farm as a laborer. So this LT symbolizes labor input, okay? The second contributing factor is called capital input. So you need to have production activity, you need not only labor, but also capital. You could need land, you could need a factory, you could need computers, you could need transportation equipment, you could need kind of buildings and structures, for example. So all factors, we combine them together are capital. And then T is frequently referred to as total factor productivity, TFP, or some people want to define this as technology, usually unobservable. You cannot see where technology is, but technology is clearly one factor which is affecting output. So for example, think of two farms in Soviet Union. One farm has 100 people, let's say, 100 machines, tractors and so forth. Another farm is equal size with this farm, first farm. So 100 people are working on the farm and 100 tractors working on the farm. But two farms could end up totally different QT. Why? The first farm is very technologically advanced. That means, they know how to cultivate land, they know how to seed, they know how to harvest. But the second farm is very technologically inferior, let's say. They are not they are not well organized. They gamble in the winter time. They don't work hard. So in that case, T will be very low. Therefore, Q will be very low. Okay, so frequent representation of this function, functional relationship between LT, KT, and TT, and QT. This functional relationship we call production function. To be more exact, we define this as aggregate production function. It is not one farm, it is not one factory story, thousands of farms aggregated with thousands of firms, thousands of shops, merchant stores, all together. So this is we call aggregate production function. We also denote LT and KT as primary factors. That means this is inescapable. You should have capital and labor, primary factors, okay? Technology is typically not necessarily primary factors, okay? So the representation of this aggregate production function is frequently assumed to have this type of relationship. We call this type of relationship as Cope-Douglas production function, naming after American scholars Cope and Douglas, two economists named Cope and Douglas. We are naming this production function as Cope-Douglas production function, okay? Now, please take a look at T, the location of T, the way T is introduced. We call this type of T introduction neutral technical progress. What is neutral? Means this T is not affecting L or K. It's kind of separate, independent, okay? Some other types of technology model, we may say that technology coming only into labor input. In other words, people are being more educated, more quality improved, things like that. Then we call that kind of technology as labor augmenting technology. In other words, it's a kind of labor biased technology. We may say that instead of labor technology or neutral technology, capital, because these days a lot of machines are equipped with the computers. So we may say that technological advancement comes from mainly capital sector. Then we call that as capital augmenting technology, or we call that as a capital biased technology. Deliberately, this model is assuming neutral technology, rather than labor augmenting or capital augmenting technology. Now, if you take both sides natural logarithm, this is a very simple mathematics. I know that Soviet universities students are very good in mathematics. Not necessarily so with some American students or European students, but I know that you learned this type of mathematics in your high school or middle school days. Even if you don't know about any mathematics, you can still find it from elementary mathematics textbook. So we call this is multiplicative form, so multiplied each term. If you take natural logarithm of both sides, you have, this should be a little bit misleading. This should be log TT rather than TT. I will explain that. This first could be kind of erratic expression. Second term, if you take log, of course, it becomes additive form. Alpha becomes in front of, located in front of this term, log LT plus beta log KT. Typically, this is log LNTT, and then if you take differentiation of logarithm of a certain variable, then this variable's growth rate is automatically coming out. In other words, in this notation, GQ means GDP growth rate, okay? And alpha GL means labor input growth rate. GK means capital growth rate. So, and the theoretical implication of alpha and beta is very important. We usually assume alpha plus beta equals to 1. We call that kind of production function as constant returns to scale. When alpha plus beta equal to 1, we call is constant returns to scale production function, or constant returns to scale type Cobb-Douglas production function. The meaning of alpha and beta is important. Alpha is the share of income in labor out of GDP, So 이거 내가 쓸 수 있게 만들어야 되는데 그거 그렇게 하려면 어떻게 해야 되지? 응? 어디 있지? 펜이 있니? 펜으로 하는 수밖에 없냐? 타자로 하면 안 돼?
네, 아니면 타자로 하셔도 돼요.
타자로 하자. 내가 입력할 수 있게. 그지? Okay. So in this case, for example,
그림이어서 그냥 타자 치시면 나와요.
여기다가 하면 돼. 네. 그럼 낫겠지. Okay. So alpha is kind of, I think, 더 펀더멘털한 자들이 어디 있지? 가장 많이 Oh, okay, here. No. Yeah, okay. So I'm trying to copy. Alpha, in this case, could be P times, P times Y, Q, wage times labor divided by P times Q. Okay, what is the meaning? Okay, total labor force is L, right? W is wage rate. So if average wage rate is $10 an hour, and there are 10 million working hours, you have total wage bill, okay? Out of price of GDP, in other words, nominal GDP, out of nominal GDP, this could be typically, for example, in the Republic of Korea, right now, roughly 0.6. You know, in Soviet economy, it could be 0.4 or 0.5. It depends how to we estimate, right? Another thing is beta, right? So beta is, let me see if I can find beta. Yes, here is a beta. Okay, so I'm getting it there, right? So beta is the share of, for example, R times K, rental rate. So suppose, for example, computers, there are 100 computers, 100 units of computer. Each rents $10, for example. Then $10 times 100 computer, $1,000. That's rental cost of capital, right? Of course, if this is a kind of transportation equipment's rental rate. If this is a building rental rate, things like that. Divided by total income PQ. So in other words, the PQ is defined as W times L plus R times K. So suppose this could be, therefore beta should be 0.4 to make 100%. In other words, out of total GDP, for example, if Korean economy has alpha 0.6, beta 0.4 means people in the form of labor cost, they are taking about 60% of total income. About 40% to income going to capital income. See? So if you, for example, from this last expression, if you divide by PQ, then it should be 1. That should be 1. And that should be alpha. In other words, WL divided by PQ plus rental cost capital divided by PQ. See? So that should be add up to 1.1. I'm demonstrating this, right? It's kind of simple mathematics, but very important concept. So if you estimate this second equation, the coefficient of ln LT gives you alpha, estimate of alpha. In the Republic of Korea, 0.6. According to my recent research, economy of Republic of Korea, it used to be around 0.4. Alpha was 0.4. But as economy develops, people's wage rate goes up relative to rent. So what happens is Korea moved from 0.4 alpha to 0.6 alpha. See? I'm not familiar with the Soviet economy, but my guess is the Soviet economy could be still, alpha could be 0.4 and beta could be 0.6. You know, so it's Soviet economist's duty how to estimate your own country's alpha and beta, for example. But what I'm pointing out, it should add up to 1. We call this as exhaustion principle. Exhaust. What is exhaustion principle? What is the exhaustion principle? That means you exhaust income into what? 2 components. You exhaust your GDP, gross national product, which should be equal to gross national income, should go back to the original contributor, factors. Who are the original factors? People and machines or buildings. So in other words, income should not be left over. It should go back to the original sources of factors. So this is the very important consequence. And I'm showing that if you take derivative, I'm not going to dwell on this mathematical derivation. I usually use this mathematical derivation I used to give in my econometrics course or some other pure economics courses. You derive this log equation, this growth rate equation. You need to how to differentiate log function. If you take differentiation of log of this a certain variable, you get growth rate of that variable. Okay. What I could skip rather than leaving that to you. I could show you log of x, for example, t, divided by time derivative t. Then if you take derivative of log variable, you need to have it should be okay. 그래. 아니 뭐 아무래도 아무것도 괜찮은데 더 나은 심볼이 없나 싶어서 찾는데 델타가 이거밖에 없나? 이거 쓰지. Okay. So delta x divided by x. So the difference, so if I express differently, it should be xt minus xt minus 1. The whole thing divided by xt minus 1. Suppose your GDP started xt minus 1 was started from, for example, suppose xt minus 1 was 100 and xt was 110 minus 100, the whole thing in bracket. And suppose xt minus 1 was 111. Okay. Divided by the whole thing divided by, for example, 100. Then, that is out of 10 out of 100. So it is a 10% growth rate. Growth rate becomes 10%. You see? So in other words, pretty simply, if you take derivative of this logarithm, you get the growth rate automatically. That's what it says. LNKT, growth rate of capital. LNLT, growth rate of labor. LNQT, growth rate of GDP. So you can review your mathematics notebook at college mathematics notebook, and you know what this equation means. Okay, so the same equation is repeated. So I will give you some numerical example. Always numerical example helps. Okay. Suppose last year Soviet economy has grown very rapidly. Let's say 5%. 5% was this GQ was 5%. Now, alpha, to make it simple, in the Soviet economy, 0.5, let's say. Labor growth, these days Soviet economy is also aging. Not much newborn babies in Soviet economy, I'm guessing. Sorry that I'm not Soviet economist, even though I have a few friends in Soviet Academy of Sciences or School of Economics, but I'm not familiar with Soviet economy. But let's assume that labor growth rate is roughly, I would say 2%. It should be less than 2% these days. New generation, you guys are not making any birth to newborn babies, right? The same phenomena in Seoul, in Korea too. At any rate, let's say, let me give you some hypothetical. And 0.5 is another share of capital, let's say. But capital has grown 4%. Let me say. Okay, then this identity, to make this identity 2%, 1%, this should be, T should be exactly 2%. What does that mean? What am I saying to you? This T should be to make this identity, right? 2%, 1/2 of 2%, 1%. 1/2 of 4%, 2%. So we call this part, we call special name, total factor input. Is this part, red one. Okay. What is the rest of the thing? So the remaining T is what I define total factor productivity. TFP in abbreviation. It's the rate of technical progress. So you know what? Here is a very important understanding. This is absolute kind of percentage figure. But we define here relative contribution. Contribution to GDP, Q. How do we calculate? Labor. Labor, we call labor contribution is 1%. Why 1%? Because 0.5 times 2%, this is labor. What about capital? Capital contribution, we say that 0.5 times 4%, so 2%. In other words, in the Soviet economy of growth of Q, which is 5%, 1% was attributable to labor input. 2% go back to the original capital input. So what is left over? 2%. So TFP, T is frequently we call Solow residual. Naming after Nobel laureate Robert Solow. He defined explicitly this is a total factor productivity or technology factor, usually unobservable. You see, this needs to be estimated from growth accounting. We don't have data for T. So that's why we define that as Solow residual. Okay? So relative contribution to Q 5%, labor is 1%, capital is 2%, T is 2%, right? So relative contribution we calculate in this manner. Okay, labor is labor divided by Q is 1% divided by 5%. So we say that labor contributed to Soviet economy's GDP 20% much. This is relative contribution. How about capital divided by Q? So you get 2% divided by 5%. So you end up with, okay, relative contribution is 40% much. By whom? By capital income. Of course, the remaining relative contribution should add up to 100. So 20%, 40%, 60%. Therefore, TFP, contribution of TFP, which is technology, should be, relative contribution should be equal to 2% divided by 5%, together 40%. In other words, relative contribution should add up to 100%. Okay? So we will use this technique to analyze South Korean economy. Okay? And in this equation, if you have this kind of partial relationship, in other words, Q divided by L is labor productivity per person output level. Per capital unit output level, we call capital productivity. Combined together, we have total factor input, as I defined here. Somewhere I define total factor input, right? Somewhere. Total factor input, right? Here. That terminology is coming out here. Total factor input, right? Okay. So let's take a look at some statistics compiled, analyzed in economy of South Korea, Republic of Korea, during the high growth period, 1963, 1973. As I mentioned, President Park, through coup d'etat, took the regime, and to justify his coup d'etat and his military activity, he wanted to push for the economic development to justify, his motivation, for example, his initiative. So what is happening? What happened? If you see it here, I think to be very fair, you can say that you can choose, these A, B, C, D is alternative concepts of capital, alternative concepts of, for example, output. So to make it simple, in output, you choose A. In capital, you choose B, on reproducible, okay? Reproducible capital. And I will explain the difference between all capital and reproducible capital is all capital includes land. Land is not reproducible. Land is there, fixed, non-reproducible, right? So eliminating land, we call reproducible. Number C is except dwellings, housings, okay? So let us use B as an alternative working concept, reproducible capital. Okay, labor, there could be employees, number of people, number of head count, or hours worked, number of people times average working hours, or human capital per worker. This is a little bit high advanced concept, but we measure human capital by number of age, number of sex, whether or not it is female or male workers. We call education level, age level. We can make a sort of composite cohort of the workers, and we can combine these together, make up human capital index. So for the time being, forget about C, forget about B, for example. Let's concentrate number of headcounts, employees in labor input, to make it simple. So these are the statistics. Look at this. Unbelievably high GDP growth rate for the South Korean economy during this period. Almost 10% annually. So during this period, South Korea economy achieved miracle, economic miracle. How can an economy can grow at annual 10% during this short period of time, 10 years? Source, capital has grown 8.3%. Of course, this is whole economy story. Non-agriculture, mining and manufacturing is the subsectors, for example. How about labor? At the time, Koreans were boom, there was a baby boom, for example. Very high rate of birth, 3.8%. So more machines, more buildings, more people were inputted into 9.9 growth rate. Okay. How about manufacturing and mining side? Even further, more accelerated growth. Almost double the growth rate of the whole economy. In other words, mining and manufacturing sector accelerated further. Reproducible asset capital, 11% instead of 8.3%. How about labor input? Labor input, a lot of people went to mining and manufacturing sector from the agricultural sector. That shows growth rate of employees. Okay. Now, how can we make out of this growth accounting? Okay, this table is very important, right? So let me explain. Now you can understand this table. If I did not explain the theory or little mathematics beforehand, you may not understand. But right now we can understand this. Okay, what about whole economy? 9.9%. You got this number. Capital, all including land, but all including land, 6.9%. Also, this table is quoting from this upper number, okay, A number, including land, okay? So, okay, this table is quoting from 6.9%, all capital including land. How about labor, 3.9%? Where did they get capital and labor shares applied? Capital share 0.4, labor share 0.6. Where did they get this number? Probably some other table. Probably some other table. Okay, this is misleading. Here we go. So in other words, they are quoting from table 21, posterior table, the tables which show up later. You see here, the first row, you see 39%, 61%. They were quoting this number to this table, 0.39, 0.61. Make growth accounting. I'm showing you how I conducted growth accounting. How? 0.39 is what? In our notation, beta. Because this is capital input, 6.9%, right? 0.39 was beta in our notation, equation-wise. 0.61 was alpha, share of labor. Labor grew 3.8%, 9.9%. So this T, 4.89%, was estimated, not observed from the data. There was no data for T. You see, from this identity, we end up with this TFP growth rate, 4.89%. Did you get it? There's one more. One more, maybe. I will explain table 21 GDP at factor cost. Yes. Let us take a look at growth accounting for mining and manufacturing. Again, where did they get this number 0.75, 0.25? Let's go back. I mean, not go back, go forward. Here. Mining and manufacturing. Capital labor shares, 75%, 25%. You see? They are quoting from table 21 to this table. To this table. So 75% was given to capital growth rate, mining and manufacturing. Am I true? Mining and manufacturing capital grew 11.0%. Let's go back, make sure. Mining and manufacturing here? Yes, 11.0%, reproducible assets. Right? Okay. Where did I get 10.6%? That must be labor growth rate. So go back to table 20. Find out mining and manufacturing labor, 10.6%. You got this number. Okay? So you can analyze, make growth accounting for mining and manufacturing alone. Now, let me ask you, relative contribution of TFP. How do you calculate relative contribution of TFP? In whole economy, entire economy, you divide 4.89% by 9.9%. So almost 50% was contributed by TFP in the whole economy. How about in growth, mining and manufacturing? You divide 7.5%, divide by 18.4. So in mining and manufacturing, TFP is relatively less contributing because 7.5% divided by 18.4% is roughly maybe 40%, 35%, for example. So you can calculate relative contribution of all these. Okay. So this is another growth accounting, GDP at factor cost, utilized capital, and labor share applied 0.25, hours worked 10.7, human capital per worker 2.2% combined. Why do you add hours worked to human capital per worker? Suppose hours worked is H. Human capital per worker is, let me say this is N, number of working hours. Suppose this is quality, human capital per worker is like a quality index. So if you think Ln N times Q by the additive property of logarithm, you have Ln N plus Ln Q, right? This, this by additive property. So this means if you take derivative, the growth rate of N is working hours, should add up to growth rate of Q, quality index. That's what I'm saying here. You have to add 10.7%. This is nothing but growth rate of N. 2.2% is growth rate of Q, right? So that's, I'm showing this should be almost like time derivative. You can see 10.7% as ln, 2.2% ln Q, for example, right? So if you denote this way, you can have this interpretation. So you have to add quality growth rate to working hours to come up with total growth rate of labor, right? So if you multiply by labor share, you get 3.225%. Okay. So we can move on to, I explained this. And the doubled capacity utilization for manufacturing, increased share of individual sector over growth. By 1974, 1976, export earnings exceeded import expenditures. So before this period, always Korean economy was in short of foreign exchange. Why? There was a foreign exchange gap. Before? When? 1974. Foreign exchange gap means export minus import was always negative. So import was always greater than export, persistent. So foreign exchange gap means export earnings is in short of import demand, import financing. Therefore, exchange gap exists, right? So we can say that this was before 19. So this we call trade balance. Balance was always in deficit. Minus. But that turned around. Why? Because successful manufacturing industrialization based on they could export a lot of wigs, a lot of labor intensive products, a lot of shirts making, a lot of little smaller cars, for example. So they could make a lot of export earning, and they could afford importing. So avoid trade imbalance, make trade balance positive, right? And commitment toward domestic resource utilization before the first 5-year plan, which was 1964, 62 to 1960, I think 65, 6. right? 5 years, including 62 and 66. %10 of GNP was domestic investment. So in 1974, 1976, became 27% of GNP was into domestic investment. So investment growth accelerated. Again, this is the information. They should have put this table ahead of this this page, so that they know you can understand how this growth accounting was made. But at any rate, this is my own growth accounting result, not textbook version. So probably I could have located this table ahead of this, my growth accounting exercise, okay? So Eugene, switch around, all right? In other words, make this table 20, 21 in for ahead of this growth accounting, okay? Location-wise. Okay, great. So Korea's real average GNP growth rate was 7.5% since 1953, but became 9.6% since 1960. World Bank observes Korea's per capita GNP growth rate during 1960-1974 period, 7.3%. Only Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan matching growth records of Korea, 4 tigers. We typically define these 4 nations, 4 tigers, because all of them recorded high growth. Korea's patterns of accumulation, savings and investment, and allocation, primary and industry shares of output, exports, imports, and so on, can be compared with Chenery and Sirkin's 101 country based on 1950-1970s nominal developing economy. Korea performed poorly during 1953-1960. I can give you more detailed Chenery and Sirkin table, but your textbook has Chenery and Sirkin the detailed table. But if I have to explain just in verbal terms, suppose they took 101 countries average growth rate, and Korea performed below average during this period, 1953-1960, but exceeded the expected norms, means average. Average by the early 1970s, Korea outperformed 101 country average. You can check with the textbook version of Chenery Sirkin table. And Korean income per capita was lower in the mid-1970s than Japan's income was in the late 1930s. So Korea was roughly 40 years behind Japan in terms of per capita income. But Korea's growth rate and efficiency in using capital was significantly higher. Korea, with lower savings rate due to inflation, has relied on more net foreign resource inflows than Japan and Taiwan. Okay. So Korea's basic change from an inward-looking import substitution, I explained, Korea didn't have any choice except adopting import substitution policy because they didn't have enough foreign reserve. foreign exchange earning was so poor, they could not import a lot of material. They could only substitute some import during 1950s. But they became outward-looking export promoter. Remarkable growth and structural change occurred. This fascinating transformation of Korean economy. Will the export-oriented growth continue in the future? This conclusion means roughly around 1979. This at the time of writing of this book, 1979, the authors were questioning in 1979 and after, in the future, Korea will be able to make an export-oriented growth? See? They were questioning. But you have the answer. Korea became major export-oriented country, even after 1979, after the President Park got assassinated. So the answer is yes. Korea became very industrialized society. But this is only, we can make this observation after 1979. And remember, this book was written in 1979. So it's natural. The authors question, will the export-oriented growth in Korea continue in the future? It's a natural question. Still, inflation was the weak point, but stabilized at 10% in 1976, 1977. And this period, why this period particularly? Because after the first oil crisis in 1974. So that's why after the first oil crisis in 1974, and oil price was quadrupled at the time. So inflation was almost inevitable, but they tried to stabilize at 10%. Since 2000, it became down, further slowed down, 3%. Korean government wanted to have more growth rather than stability, because growth could promote stability to some extent. Growth could be the only means of taking care of welfare benefits, welfare expenditures. Without growth, you cannot promote welfare, nation's welfare. So Korean government wanted to grow, make further growth. So this is a ternary table. You can take a look at, but not as important as growth accounting result. Okay. So let us move to 공유 중지하고 다시 공유로 가서
챕터 5 거를
어디 공유로 가서 화면 공유?
네. 여기.
Chapter 5. 공유. Okay. Chapter 5 is much more verbal, easy to understand. So Chapter 4 was a little bit difficult because of growth accounting analysis you need to understand. But Chapter 5 is basically sources of Chapter 4. In other words, Korea maintained very rapid industrializing regime and foreign trade promotion. So to understand how Korea has maintained this successful transformation, we need to look at evolution of incentive policies. As I mentioned, first phase was based on import substitution. Incentives toward exporters started to be implemented. Exporters were given import rights to popular items, also direct subsidies. So for example, as a case study, I will show you, I will let you understand, for example, import substitution. 다시 공유가 중지가 됐구나. 가만히 있어봐. 이거,
네.
이거였지?
네, 저기 끝에. 네. 공유.
Okay. We got stopped, but import substitution, I will give you some important example. Samsung, one of the largest, was originally started from as a sugar cane importer and also textile import. Samsung started like as a basic importer. You may have heard LG Group, another home electronics giant. LG started from hygiene market or chemical market, chemical ingredients importer. They started. So, you cannot give import licensing to 100 different firms. You simply cannot do that. Why? First of all, to be able to import, you need good knowledge of information. Where to buy good sugar cane? How much should we pay? So these things, when they were selected, already Samsung and LG was kind of one of the better companies, organizations. Lucky Gold Star now became home electronics giant, but they started as import substitution, import licensing holder. And then incentives toward exporters started to be implemented. For example, exporters were given import rights to popular items, also direct subsidies. And in second phase, expansion policy after Park military government takes over, inflation was still significant, but export incentives started to be increased. So into the third phase, maintenance of the previous export-focused policies, the government was able to maintain relative price stability. Inflation was still growing at a higher rate than the industrialized countries. Exchange rate was still sometimes adjusted by government intervention. The currency was devalued several times as well to make their exports competitive. Okay. So to let you understand, for example, suppose $1 was exchanged to 101. Suppose this became $1 becomes, let's say, 151. We call this as one devalued by 50%. In other words, one's price got depreciated, right, by 50%. Then who gains? Exporters. Why? If they were exporting $1 when they go to the bank, $1 was they used to give this exporter 101. Now, if they bring $1 they earned to their bank is giving 151. So happy exporters. So devaluation is an incentive for exporters. How about importers? Who loses? Importers. Why? Well, to import, previously, they need to buy $1. And they had to put down 101 previously. Now they need 151, 50% more money to put down to open letter of credit for importing. So importers are discouraged. They lose. So this devaluation policy is for one of the export promotion policy. Okay. As the import-export balance improved, the government began to liberalize the imports. Why? To make domestic producers compete against importers, right? So to make domestic product more competitive, they need this kind of policy switch. In 1967, the positive list approach was changed with a negative list approach. It is a confusing concept, okay? Positive list means, if I have to sort of redefine, positive list means the list which is automatically approved for importation. That means if the items is not belonging to positive list, the item cannot be imported. What is a negative list approach? Negative means just the opposite. You only list of items prohibited from import. So that means if you belong to this negative list, you cannot import. All the rest is more open for import. So it's more encompassing approach. That is, it is more widening import allowed list of items. Right? However, there were no further increase in input liberalization due to the adverse trends, probably around 1974. They could not afford further liberalization because they had to pay for high bills of oil. In other words, they were running short of foreign reserve near oil crisis, after oil crisis. After the oil crisis, the efforts again increased. Following 1968, the next several years saw the disappearance of special tariffs, and the tariff exemption system was changed to a drawback system. Okay, this is a little bit technical words. Disappearance of special tariffs is usually high walls, like luxury items. They put like 500% tax tariff, 300% tariff. These got disappeared, started to be disappeared. Normalization of tariff. And instead of tariff exemption system, drawback system means kind of refund system. In other words, this is kind of refund system. Tariff exemption is something like this. Okay, suppose if you have to, if you want to export your products, you need some raw material. So for some raw materials imports, if you are going to export after processing that raw material, your tariff payment are exempt for raw material. That's tariff exemption system. But there were a lot of kind of cheating and a lot of things could go wrong with this system. So you know what they did is kind of drawback system. That means, okay, you pay tariff. Even if you are exporter, you pay tariff first. And then we will get refunding. We will refund your tariff because you are exporting. So this kind of indirect system change is very important lesson for many developing nations. Final reform in 1977 reduced the tariff escalation between raw materials and finished products. What is tariff escalation? It's a little bit more technical product. Let me see if I can draw tariff escalation picture. Let me see set slide. Okay. Tariff escalation. Is the following case, like see if I can sub it, maybe. some drawing. Okay. Okay, another sorry, drawing. So this is kind of a tariff rate on the vertical axis. Suppose this is I should say degree of processing. So for example, suppose this is raw materials. And you have here intermediate goods. And here you have final goods. And this is all degree of processing, for example. Okay. So in that case, tariff rate is a structure is something like this. Raw material tariff rate is very low. Tariff rate is very low. So for example, very low, like this. Okay. But intermediate goods, a little bit higher. So for example, final goods, very high. So for example, right. So this kind of escalation is almost like escalator. Tariff structure gets higher when you make final goods. This is a typical example of tariff escalation in many countries to protect their final goods industry. For example, Soviet economy, Soviet Union. Well, Soviet Union wanted to protect their automobile industry, then put 100% tariff rate. Sports car out of Italy could sell 50,000. Now it becomes 100,000 in Soviet Union. But raw materials, relatively less tariff rate. So this type of tariff structure we call tariff escalation. So to protect their final goods industry, a lot of countries are adopting this type of tariff escalation. That's what I mean by tariff escalation between raw materials and finished products. Okay. So, for example, you can see here, it's a little bit more technical table, but I need to explain these a little bit more difficult table to read. Nominal exchange rate means it's really nominal exchange rate. In other words, official rate was, for example, 51 per dollar in 1958. This table shows continuously devaluation. Now 400 by 1976, 485. Effective rate means this official rate is export weighted or import weighted effective rate. So what that means, exports are weighted by destination countries' exchange rate. Imports are weighted by origin of importers' countries. So this is more sort of what we call effective exchange rate. Wholesale price index is here. You can see major trade partners. Korea's inflation was a lot higher, 389, based on 100 as base year. Major trade partners were 207. So if this country, Korea, was more inflationary country, then effective rate should be further depreciated. That's we call PPP adjustment exchange rate. What is PPP? PPP is a little bit difficult word, but purchasing power parity. So in other words, we used to call this as a McBurger index, McDonald hamburger index, price index. For example, McDonald hamburger in downtown Irkutsk could be so many rubles. In Tokyo, it could be so many yen. In Seoul downtown, it could be so many won. So we call this as price index gas affected exchange rate. So price effect adjusted exchange rate is what we call effective exchange rate. So in terms of effective exchange rate is lower than, for example, this nominal exchange rate effective rate. Why it is lower? Because price adjusted. Okay. The level of subsidies increased very little. New export incentives were also introduced during the period, such as discounts on railway freight and electricity rates for exporters. Developers of new markets were given monopoly rights, and some preference was given to exporters in the allocation of import quota items. So a lot of export promotion policies. Direct tax reductions, however, were abolished in 1973 because these direct tax reductions can be part of political contribution. Okay, so they got rid of this tax reduction policy. The industrial policy changes that happened in the early 1960s did not show clear signs of significant increase in the incentive to export. They, however, replaced a system of incentives based on multiple exchange rates with a simpler and more stable system, which can be considered the foundation of continued quick export growth. So they got more stable system. Okay, this shows exports by commodity group and major commodities. Let's take a look at what was the major items during for example, 60. Crude minerals except fuel was a major item, 48%, right? And manufactured, classified by, for example, plywood, for example, was the major items. By 1976, the things have changed a lot. Crude minerals almost disappeared. And plywood, which is very labor-intensive good, became major export items. Okay, things like this can be checked. So patterns of export expansion, when the export patterns are examined, the rapid expansion seems clear. Korea exported to 19 countries until 1960s. By 1976, this number increased to 175. This can be attributed to Korean effort to penetrate new markets. In turn, this expansion led to a rapid acceleration of GNP growth. Okay. Let me stop here for further discussion. I think we are running out of time. Let me continue from this pattern of export expansion next week. Okay, let me start my lecture and let me give you opportunity to make comments or questions, raise questions. Okay.
I have a question.
Baker. Okay.
Comprehensive lecture. My name is Evgeny Tishchenko, PhD student.
Right. Evgeny?
Yes. If we have low labor productivity, but high technological externalities,
right.
In Russia, for example, R&D sector or semiconductor industry in Korea in 1970s as comparative advantages, how can we re-estimate a total factor productivity function in such a way?
Okay. So total factor productivity, as I mentioned, as I explained, is residual. You first make accounting of GDP growth rate and deduct that from that labor contribution and capital contribution. So the residual becomes a TFP, okay, total factor productivity and technology factor. So in general, if we enhance R&D and so forth, if we adopt more new science and technology, then TFP technology will grow further. It will be accelerated, okay? But again, Korea's semiconductor industry was started to be developed from 1980s, not 1970s. It's a relatively new entry into the spectrum of commodities and industries. Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you very much.
Any other question? Alina?
네.
Aronova.
Еронова.
Yeah.
What do you think is the forecast for the recent economy for the 2021? I mean, it is possible slowdown in exports be reason for the slowdown in economic growth.
Right. So, like any other economy, this is a very natural law. You have a booming, very fast growing period. At the same time, we call convergence period. What is convergence? That is, your growth rate becomes almost very stable and slower growth rate becomes. So as the economy grows, you know why? People, labor input, there is no unlimited labor supply. People are not giving birth. New babies, new generation are not coming in. So labor force, even Soviet Union, now labor force is very slow in terms of growth rate, right? How about the capital? You build roads, railroads, plants, buildings, housings, machines, automobile. but you get crowded out. You know, you become, there is no more rows. There are no more buildings needed.
Mm.
So capital gets crowded. So it's a convergence stage. Technology too. After a certain level, technological advancement slows down. So naturally, GDP growth rate gets slowed down. And Korea now is suffering from slowed down economy. More sort of convergence stage. We call that as a convergence stage. Converge to the norm, average growth rate of advanced nations. So you are no longer new entry. You are no longer developing economy. As you become almost in developed economy, everything slows down. Everything is converging to the nominal rate of growth. That's what we call convergence phenomena, not divergence phenomena. Okay, Elena?
Thank you.
Professor, my name is Lina. I'm from Tomsk State University. And in your lecture,
Lina, let me pronounce your last name. Lina Zavialova.
All right. So in your
Am
lecture,
I pronouncing it correctly?
sure.
Lina Zavialova?
Yes, Lina Zavialova.
Good. Okay.
So
Yes.
you mentioned the foreign exchange gap of Korea. So I
Right.
wonder whether other three tigers also faced this kind of condition, and if yes, how did they overcome it? Were the methods of them similar to the Korean ones?
Mhm. Okay, so foreign exchange gap, as I mentioned, in the 1950s, Korean economy did not have good exportable goods. They were so poor, they were dependent on imported rice, imported grain, imported fuel, imported everything. They did not have enough foreign reserve, so they could not import a lot. So they were just surviving. But after 1962, Koreans became realizing that they need to export something to be able to import something, because they have to earn some income from outside the world. And using foreign aid from the United States and a lot of assistance by, for example, Japanese government, for example, at the beginning, at least, they tried to build basic factories like POSCO, Pohang Steel Company, and all these firms got established, and they tried to sell very labor-intensive products overseas, because at that time, Korea was very much labor-abundant nation, not capital-abundant nation. So as you saw today, the table, they sold a lot of textile items. You know, clothings are very much labor-intensive products. You use more labor than capital, right? A lot of factory workers. Also, they made a lot of plywood, which is very labor-intensive products, and they could sell those to overseas market, started earning some income, foreign exchange, so that they could import more products they need. So in other words, industrialization began to start. Okay, Lina?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, today we have tried to cover very core part, industrialization, how to interpret that industrialization, how to quantify labor input, capital input, and GDP output. The most important concept is a total factor productivity technology concept. As I said, you don't have data. You have the data for number of working people. You have the data for automobiles. You have the data for capital input. You have the data for GDP from national accounting, but you don't have data for technology. So how do we estimate technological advancement? By residual method, as I try to demonstrate. So that's the core part of understanding economic growth accounting. Okay, so as long if because of the short limited time, my presentation and your understanding could have been very limited, but please revisit textbook version. Try to understand each number on the in the table, how they got this number and that number, as I try to demonstrate today. So please do so. Make an exercise. Okay, because similar question will be probably asked in the midterm or final exam. Okay, 장을가 교수님, do you have any specific question in mind from Tomsk State University? Nice to see you again.
교수님 안녕하세요.
안녕하세요.
네, 강의해 주셔서 감사합니다.
네, 어느 정도 좀 이해가 될 수 있는지 모르겠습니다.
네.
네.
아주 좋은 그 내용을 전해 주셔서 감사합니다.
네, 감사합니다. Okay, I will have to say bye to all of you, but please make sure that you can always send me email question directly, okay? Without going through anyone, or you can send any question to my teaching assistant, Miss Bin, right? You have her email number. So I will try to answer all of your questions. I hope to see you next week. Okay? Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.